I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled SBIR and STTR for postdocs and graduate students. This webinar is presented to you and sponsored by the Center for Innovative Technology. Presentation is going to be given by Lisa Keurig, who is the managing partner of BBC Entrepreneurial Training and Consulting. A little bit about CIT before we get started. CIT, the Center for Innovative Technology, it works with early stage companies to help accelerate the next generation of technology and technology companies in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are a state-funded nonprofit, so we only work with Virginia-based companies, and we often also work oftentimes with university researchers, postdocs, and grad students to help them establish and move on to their next ventures. So our goal is to help accelerate technology in the Commonwealth by various means. The Entrepreneur Division, of which I'm part of, works to help early stage companies access the private and federal funding sources that are needed to properly establish and develop the technology and create long-lasting companies with to help increase the tax base here in the Commonwealth to obviously accomplish many goals. And we do that through the Federal Funding Assistance Program, of which I manage, and also our GAP Investment Seed Fund. Talk a little bit about each of these. The GAP Fund invests in early stage Virginia-based technology companies. It's a seed fund that provides early stage funding to help leverage additional outside venture capital. So this is a dilutive funding source, much in the line of venture capital, angel investments. We do have reps at CIT who visit almost monthly the different regions across the state, including Blacksburg, Charlottesville, Norfolk, Tidewater area, Richmond, Northern Virginia, and other regions as needed. So if you're interested in our investment fund at some point, you're going to be spinning out some technology, starting a company when you leave, certainly our GAP Investment Fund would be a great resource for you to engage with. The sooner you can do that, the better you understand the process and the opportunity and whether or not you are a fit with that opportunity. Our Federal Funding Assistance Program, again, which I manage, works with Virginia-based companies to help them in their efforts to learn about and secure the SBIR and STTR funding, grants, and contracts. I'm Robert Brook. I'm the director of the Federal Funding Assistance Program, so it's my job exclusively to engage with these activities and to help companies and researchers one-on-one, provide training and other support that we provide. We have a small seed fund that we can oftentimes deploy to help you hire the appropriate outside SBIR consultants. Today's instructor is one of those that we encourage you to engage with. We also provide the training like today's workshop, as well as other training and webinars across the state. We do have some other upcoming training for those who might want to learn more about it after today's event. We actually have a workshop next Tuesday in Richmond, Virginia, for those who are able to. If you haven't registered or planning to attend and you're able to take the day off, we do have a full day workshop set. There's a small fee for Virginia-based companies and university researchers, and I plan to actually send everybody out who's on today's webinar a link that will offer you a special discount off that low fee. So if that's something you're interested in and you can make it, that'd be great. We have plenty of seats left for that event. These are typically smaller events, 15 to 25 people max. We also do have plans for April, May, and June to have additional workshops in Blacksburg, Fairfax, and Norfolk and Hampton, Virginia. So if you would like to wait for those opportunities, certainly we will make sure you are aware of those. We will add everybody who's on today's webinar to receive my monthly federal funding newsletter. We basically send out one monthly newsletter and occasionally special event-only emails that go out. So please look for those in the future if you have any interest in participating. We have some pre-recorded webinars, and I will send out this URL at the bottom of this page to everybody at the conclusion of today's webinar. Along with today's presentation, we'll email that out. So you can access some of these pre-recorded webinars that we've given over the last year to learn more about the SBIR program, a little bit about what projects look like from a feasibility standpoint, eligibility requirements that go into much more detail than we're going to provide today, team building, webinar, and there's a commercialization plan webinar. As you'll learn a little bit about today, we're going to talk a little bit about what the SBIR program is about. We're going to talk a little bit about eligibility, and we're going to talk a little bit about the commercialization side of things, but we're not going to touch upon them as much as these other webinars did. So we'll send you this link. Many of these are free for university researchers, postdocs, and grad students, so take advantage of that if you can. And most of them were actually given by today's instructor or other representatives at her company. So again, welcome to today. Today's presentation is actually brought to you in part through a grant award that CIT has received from the U.S. Small Business Administration, the SBA. Again, a copy of today's webinar materials will be emailed to everybody after the conclusion of the session. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and use, you should have a little a box there available and to use the questions box. Don't use the other boxes. We'll make sure we are able to answer your questions. If we can't answer your question, if we're going into too much detail that might be better answered by your viewing one of the other free webinars, we will let you know about that. Or we'll might delay that answering of that question to a more appropriate time at the end of the webinar. And we will also follow up with you if there's any. If you can't get the right answers today because of timing, we can certainly follow up with you one-on-one. Today's speaker, again, is Lisa Couric. Lisa is the general partner of BBC Entrepreneurial Training and Consulting. Lisa's company, BBC, has been a company we've been utilizing for webinars and training for many years now. They are one of the best in the business. We work with them to develop specific webinar training like today on a very unique, focused level. We have other workshops and training they give, so one of the best in the country. You're going to be lucky to hear from what they have to say. We will actually post the recording of today's webinar on our website in the next few days as well. So if you want to go back and refer to anything that's talked about here, you can certainly go back and do that. There will be no fee for those to do that. Might require an additional login registration just so we know who viewed it. With that, Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to you. I'm going to give it from the beginning. There you go. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Lisa Couric. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate having the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. And let's see, I am just trying to make sure, I'm assuming, Rob, you can hear me, but I'm having a little trouble advancing the slides. So you can
try it again. Go ahead.
Let's see if I can. No, I don't seem to be able to advance the slides.
Go ahead. Okay, there he goes. All right, you should have it now. There you go.
There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully that was our technical goblin for the day. So I've got a lot of stuff to cover, and since this is a webinar, I'm going to try and touch on each of these things briefly, and then I am very happy to answer questions. Either if they're appropriate, Rob will be monitoring the questions that come in and can jump in and ask them, or at the end of the webinar, and then certainly at the end of the webinar I'll make sure you have my contact information so that you are welcome to email or call me if you have specific questions. I'm going to define SBIR and STTR and tell you a bit about what those programs are. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about commercializing research discoveries, and that will be primarily research discoveries made in academic institutions, since the topic of the focus of today's webinar is for postdoctoral fellows and graduate students. We'll touch on the opportunity or the option of starting a company, and I'm going to place that in the context of where it fits related to commercializing research discoveries. We're going to talk about, quote-unquote, using SBIR to take your technology with you, although we're going to explore a little bit about whose technology it is in these first few sections. I'll talk a little bit about investigating new sources of grant funding for commercialization, and then we'll dig into some of the eligibility requirements for SBIR and STTR. We'll do some of the basics just to kind of bring the relevance of how academic institutions participate and how postdoctoral fellows and graduate students might be able to participate. We'll tie things up with kind of coming up with a little list of what you're going to need if you do decide you'd like to pursue SBIR and STTR funding, and then touch briefly on investigating career opportunities within the world of SBIR and STTR funded companies. So with that, Let me just briefly define SBIR and STTR and give you the context for all of the topics we're going to talk about today. SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research. STTR stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. In the context of what we're going to discuss today, you should consider them to be equivalent. They are federal funding mechanisms. Collectively, the amount of money that the federal government awards every year through the SBIR and STTR programs is over $2 billion, in fact close to $2.5 billion. Now, I'm going to define all of these terms a little bit later when we get into the eligibility, but what I want you to be aware of as we start to talk about commercializing technology from academic institutions and starting companies is what SBIR is and what it isn't. It isn't basic research money, and it really isn't even applied research money. It's product development money. The focus of SBIR and STTR is to get products developed and commercialized, and in fact, the goal of SBIR is commercialization. The types of products that SBIR and STTR funds are products that are based on what's called technological innovation. And we'll take a little bit of time to talk about that term a little bit later, but think about these products as very, very, very challenging to develop. So there's a long amount of time and a lot of science, a lot of research and development that will have to be done in order to take the technology innovations and get them to work in a product. The only institutions or the only entities that are eligible to apply for SBIR and STTR are small businesses. We'll define small business in a little bit, but something to note, academic institutions, universities are not eligible to apply for SBIR, and they're not eligible to apply for STTR. So as we look at these mechanisms and as we look at how you can participate, one of the things you'll need to note is that it's only small businesses that apply for and receive SBIR and STTR. Academic institutions can participate in collaboration, and we'll touch on that a little bit. And then the ultimate goal is commercialization. So keep that in mind as we talk about how you as graduate students and postdocs might be able to participate with small businesses that receive SBIR and STTR funding. So one of the things you got to start to think about, and I'm really kind of looking at this from the context of you as individuals, as an individual graduate student and as an individual postdoc, as you're taking a look at your goals and aspirations, and as you're taking a look at what you're going to do once you complete your fellowship or complete your your terminal degree, you need to think about what your goal is, both personally and what your goal is for the technology. And so we're going to make some assumptions. We're going to make an assumption that you've made some research discoveries, and then in fact those discoveries have the potential to translate out of the academic institution, be turned into products, and be commercialized. And although this might seem like an odd concept, one way to commercialize is actually through publishing if we use commercialization in the broadest sense of the word. I'm going to narrow the definition a little bit. But if we look at it very broadly and say my goal is to get the technology ideas, to get this enabling technology out into the field to be used. And oftentimes when I meet with researchers in particular, I say, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to get the technology out into the field? And they say, well, I want to do good for mankind. I want to cure diseases. I want to eliminate famine. Whatever your goals are, if your goals are to get the technologies into the field for doing good, publishing is actually a way to do it. If the technologies can be published in a way that others can take the information and implement those technologies, that's one way of disseminating that knowledge. But the alternative is if you want to make money. And this is where we're going to start to talk about commercializing the technology in the context of transferring that technology to a company so that the company can take the technology, turn it into a product, and sell it to make money. And so it's really important for you as individuals to determine what your goals are, because in fact it turns out that the goal of doing good for mankind doesn't really translate very well into successful commercial entities. So let's pretend you have a great idea and you are within an academic institution. You want to take yourself and that great idea and you want to do something with it. And we're going to assume that in addition to doing good, you'd like to make money, or you'd like to see the technology truly commercialized through a business of some sort. One of the first things you're going to have to ask yourself, and this is very important, is who owns your ideas? there are some distinctions I'll make between employees of an institution and students. And I might have both graduate students and postdocs on this call, and your ideas might be treated differently. So we're going to come to in a minute the concept of who owns the technology. But whatever happens as far as your ideas, whoever owns it, the first thing you have to do when you're within the academic institution is disclose those potential inventions to the appropriate office within your institution. Typically the Technology Transfer Office, Technology Commercialization Office, they're called different things, but ultimately the office within your institution that's responsible for determining what ideas are protectable through patents or copyrights. They then have to determine whether or not the institution itself wants to pursue diligence in protecting that intellectual property. And then thirdly, if that institution decides to pursue intellectual property, what happens? The caveat is if you're a student, you need to understand your employment requirements versus a student. If you're a student, your ideas may be your own and may not be owned by the institution. But for most of you, if you're employed by the institution, you've agreed, and I hope you realize that, to assign any inventions that you have to that institution. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and we'll come back to this in a minute. So first, disclose. So you need to know where these great ideas, where these inventions have to be disclosed within your institution. Typically what then will happen is that organization, the Technology Transfer Office, will do due diligence on the idea, and that due diligence will include both whether or not it's protectable through a patent or other means, and if so, and this is really the important part, is there commercial value in the technology, because it costs a lot of money to protect intellectual property. They will then make a decision on whether or not they're going to pursue covering that intellectual property and pursue the patents, or whether they're going to decline to pursue the patents. And sometimes they'll decline because it's either not patentable or the opportunity doesn't seem reasonable, and they may decline for other reasons. If they choose to decline pursuing coverage of that idea, then they'll typically return it to the inventor, although you should pay attention because there may be some residual royalties that you owe to them should you choose to commercialize that technology. If they do decide to pursue intellectual property, then ultimately their responsibility, and this is partly their responsibility through the Bayh-Dole Act, is to diligently pursue commercialization of that intellectual property. They do that through licensing, and they essentially have a choice. The institution can choose whether they want to license to an existing company or whether they, usually with the inventors of the technology, would like to start a new company. This is primarily going to be a business decision on the part of the Technology Transfer Office in trying to determine what is the route that will give them the best return on their investment. So the point here is to say, A, you probably don't own your ideas, at least if you're not a student anymore. The institution owns them, and the institution will decide whether or not to pursue protection of those ideas, and then if they do choose to do so, they'll decide how to license it. So you don't have complete control over what happens with your ideas. That means, therefore, that you need to make sure you understand your institution's intellectual property rights policies, who owns what, how they divvy up royalties if the institution licenses that technology. You should assume that if you're employed by the institution, that you've agreed to assign the ownership of any intellectual property on which you are determined to be an inventor to that institution. And you need to understand the difference between inventorship and ownership. Inventorship is defined by law. So you can't negotiate who's an inventor. That has to do with the legal definitions of inventorship and what each person has contributed to the invention. But the ownership of those inventions or the practice of those inventions can be assigned or negotiated to different institutions. And so therefore you should assume, and you should check into this, that you've assigned any future intellectual property that you develop to the institution that employs you. One aside is to make sure you're careful not to publicly disclose anything prior to the institution looking at the patentability of it. And that's a big issue with academic institutions where you're presenting at conferences, where you're publishing. So be careful of that. So determine whether or not the intellectual property ownership is retained by you. If you're a student, it probably is, or whether it's owned by the institution that employs you. And that's probably the case if you're employed. Something I want to talk about as we look a little bit further is the institution doesn't sell products. So University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, universities don't exist to make and sell product, but what they do have is a portfolio of ideas that are protected by patents, and their job is to find a home for those patents with a company that will pursue commercialization, and when the company is successful doing that, they pay the royalties back to the institution. If you want to get the rights back to that intellectual property through a company that you either go to work for or that you form, what you have to keep in mind is transfer of that technology is A, based on negotiation, you have to negotiate it, and B, it's based on your coming to them with a viable business opportunity. So being able to present a plan, just because you invented it is not sufficient for them to license it to you unless you can show them how you can be successful commercializing that technology. So one of the things that we see regularly, and I work with hundreds and hundreds of companies over the years that are at the same stages as where you might be, very early stage companies that are licensing in very early stage technologies. And the misconception is that once the technology development is done, that the commercialization part is easy. But if that were the case, we'd all be lying on a beach somewhere instead of still working for a living. So the idea is there is no such thing as a build it and they will come business model. So the concept of having a viable commercialization strategy in which to negotiate rights to that intellectual property is very key. So I want to just briefly define for you the commercialization, which is the ability to provide a solution to a problem in exchange for money. So the technology ideas that you have or that you want to work on or that you'd like to get SBIR funding for are those solutions that you've come up with. The market is what we'll call the problem, and the commercialization strategy is how you're going to make money. And this is what you're going to have to get your arms around. So if you are interested as an inventor in participating in SBIR and STTR, you're going to have to start to become conversant or find people to work with you who are conversant in topics related to commercialization. Now, I'm making an assumption in this part of our discussion that you somehow are an inventor on the technology. But as postdocs and graduate students, you might not be, but you might be very interested in going to work for companies that are getting SBIRs and STTRs, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit too. Regardless, whether you're an inventor, whether you're working with someone else who's an inventor, as you're looking at leaving the academic institution to participate with a small business, or maybe staying within the academic institution and collaborating with the small business, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that the goal of SBIR and STTR is commercialization. And what tends to happen is you and your partners and your colleagues are going to make decisions to pursue SBIR and STTR based on the strength of the technology. And if you neglect to also make that decision based on the strength of the commercial opportunity, there are a number of tremendous pitfalls that you're going to encounter. One, if you don't have a viable commercialization strategy, you are highly unlikely to ever get access to the licenses you need from the institution, because they're not just looking at whether or not you can get the technology to work, they're looking at whether or not you can commercialize it, because that's the only way they get their return on investment, through royalties. B, if you're looking to make a career decision to work with a small business to develop these technologies into products, your career decision shouldn't be based on whether or not the technology can work. It should be based on whether or not, contingent on the technology working, there's a strong and viable commercialization strategy, because that's ultimately how you're going to sustain your career in a small business that grows into a not such small business. So one of the things you must do early on in trying to determine whether you want to work with SBIR and STTR or work with companies that do is ensure that there's a credible commercialization strategy. Now, a couple of things to note here. SBIR and STTR funds very early stage high-risk technology, and it is true that many SBIR STTR projects from the technical perspective will fail, because the goal is to take very challenging technologies and try and get them to work, and they want you to take a lot of risks. So the technology might fail, and that can happen. So we talk about, if you're doing life sciences research and applying to NIH, hypothesis-driven research. So hypotheses by definition are unproven. So you are willing to take a risk to take this early stage technology, this early stage science, these discoveries that you've come up with, and you're willing to take a risk and say, yes, I think I can prove the hypothesis that I can turn this into a product. The commercialization piece is also hypothetical. So you are stating a hypothesis that there are customers out there that are willing to buy this product, and you want to do the same level of experimentation to prove that hypothesis. So you need to identify a market. You need to complete a competitive analysis. You need to determine not just whether the market is there, but how you'll actually generate revenue through getting this technology to the market. You'll need to determine what you're going to need to achieve not just R&D but commercialization. So you're going to need money and people. So additional resources in the form of both money and people to help you go from 2 scientists and a patent to a fully integrated company commercializing technologies. And chances are you're going to need investors and partners. So you're going to have to identify what the resources are you're going to need and where they're going to come from. So this little scheme work on commercialization strategy and planning is very important. And as Rob mentioned, he's got some other webinars on commercialization. But in saying, how do I as a postdoc or a graduate student get involved with SBIR and STTR, it's not just having the science and technology, but it's knowing that there's a credible path to commercialization contingent on your ability to reduce the technology to practice. That also probably means that if you want to do this, you want to make sure you don't just have a bunch of strong scientists, your PIs, your co-postdocs and graduate students. You want to make sure you have business advisors, business and commercialization expertise. So let's say you want to start a company. So again, we've got 2 options. Your technology, if the institution, if the university decides to pursue protection, they're then going to look to license. They may license to an existing company. They may license to a startup. Now you've got to start to think about how involved in commercialization do you want to be, right? Not just in R&D. You may be the molecular biologist. You may be the material scientist, and you're working diligently to get the product developed. But if you're going to stake your career on moving into this company, you want to figure out how involved in the commercialization side, whether you're doing it or whether your colleagues are doing it, because this is where your risk is going to be. And take a look at the risk profile. As you kind of climb up these various roles, this is where the risk becomes much greater. And you've got to decide how much of a risk taker you want to be. So from the lowest levels, you might be an advisor. Maybe you were integral in the development of the technology, and you may say, you know what, I'm pretty risk averse. I like no risk. I like having benefits. I like having a secure job. You may choose to just be an advisor or maybe a paid consultant to another organization. So one way that you can, this kind of addresses how you can be involved in SBIR and STTR. You can be involved as an advisor or a consultant, or maybe you're involved on a subcontract to the university, continuing to do some of the science work that you did previously. You may get involved at a higher level by acting as the lead on a collaboration through a subcontract with a small business. You want to take a little more risk? Go work for the small business as an employee. Because they're a small business working on high-risk technology, that's much riskier than you're staying at the academic institution and participating on a subcontract. If that subcontract fails, if that company fails, you're employed by a big academic institution. That project might go away, but you might not necessarily lose your job. You want to start to really take risk. You can help co-found the company. Now, co-founding the company doesn't mean you go to work for the company. So you may be an inventor on the technology, you may help co-found a company, but you might decide still not to become employed by that company. And then the riskiest thing of all is you to actually take the lead in being the entrepreneur and say, no, I want to start my own company. I want to be the lead entrepreneur, or my colleagues and I want to be the lead entrepreneurs. We're going to start the company. We're going to license the technology. We're going to be the leads in getting the SBIR, STTR, and other resources into the company to pursue commercialization. So it's as much a personal decision as it is a business decision. In the absence of strong technology and in the absence of a commercialization model, you're crazy to pursue this. I would never pursue this on science alone. But if you have not just the belief, the worst thing you can do is believe. Belief is immaterial here. You need to have the data. You need to run the experiments, not the scientific data, but the market data, the feedback from customers, from partners, from investors. If you can get that and you want to take the risk in going to become an entrepreneur, that's how I would make that decision. And then you can start to take a look at starting a company. So, and as you do that, what you have to say is, what are you bringing because you're not going to bring everything. And whatever you don't bring, you're going to have to find from others. So maybe you are bringing the technology with you. There's a program we'll talk about in a minute, a couple of programs from some of the federal agencies that encourage postdocs, particularly those either that have been well trained and immersed in certain technologies or that are actually inventors on the technologies, to be the vehicle to take the technology and go become a principal investigator or a key scientist at a small business on SBIRs. So you might bring that to the table, and you might be able to take that technology to the company, whether it's a company you co-found or whether it's a company that you become an employee of. And think back to that risk profile. Being an employee of the company is less risky for you as an individual than being the co-founder of the company or and being the entrepreneur. Maybe you bring not the technology but the expertise. You might not be an inventor on the technology, and you might not be the material scientist, but you might be the engineer who knows how to take the material and engineer it that somebody else invented and engineer it into a medical implant. So you don't have to be an inventor on the technology to participate in an SBIR company and or to co-found an SBIR company. You might bring, one of the cool things about SBIR and STTR, unlike basic research grants, and it's really important that you know this, basic research grants typically are very, very, very narrow in their focus in studying a particular scientific phenomena. SBIRs and STTRs take the discoveries made in that narrowly defined basic research and apply them to problems that will bring in typically 2, 3, 4. They're very multidisciplinary. So it's the material scientist working with the engineer, working with the clinician, working with a manufacturing expert who ultimately can take that scientific discovery and turn it into a product and commercialize it. So to participate in SBIR and STTR, you might not be an inventor and you might not be the person who knows of the technology that's going to be integrated, but you might bring in expertise in other areas that are going to help get it reduced to practice. You may bring the depth of experience working with a particular technology, and or you might bring money. Now, granted, I understand when I'm talking to an audience of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, I doubt that the last one I mentioned is what you are going to bring to the table. But your expertise, your networks, to the extent that you can bring the technology, the expertise, the experience, and the money all together, this is what you need. So figure out where you fit. If you're the technologist, find the expertise in the application of the technology, find the experienced people who've done this before, and find the money. That's when you're ready to start a company. So Rob asked me to kind of cover strategies for taking your technology with you. So the first thing I want to just summarize, I think we figured out, is that it may not be your technology. So understanding that there's a difference between inventorship and ownership. Understanding that your technology, if you're employed somewhere else, might not be yours alone is important. You might have co-inventors and you might have somebody else who owns it. But if you choose to be the entrepreneur, you can start a company, license the technology, finance the company, and go work at the company. And that's one way for you to take the technology with you. But another way to do this is to find an existing entrepreneur, somebody maybe who's done this before, somebody who's familiar with starting companies. Maybe they have an existing company, maybe they're willing to create a new company based on the technologies that you'd like to see transferred. In fact, I've seen many occasions where serial entrepreneurs, individuals who've started companies and been both successful and failed with them, when they're looking for their next venture, they'll go to a university technology transfer office looking for technologies in a particular field or area to license and do this yet again. So finding an existing entrepreneur who can found or co-found a company with you, or finding an existing company, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, have that company license the technology, have them finance the company, but you go work for them. That's another great way for you to stay involved with the technology, be lower on that risk profile, and still continue to transfer with your technology. So how do you find a company? This is something you might not have thought about before, but as we start to dig into the details of SBIR, we're going to talk about doing your homework, and in some of the other webinars that Rob has, you know, if you decide you do want to pursue SBIR and STTR as a funding mechanism, you're going to want to do some homework as to what SBIR and STTR have funded in the past. Well, here's a different way to think about finding a home for your technology. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies that have been receiving SBIRs since the 1980s. The SBIR program started in 1980. The STTR program started in 1992, 91. And there are databases of these companies. And you can search these databases, and you might be able to find a company that's already received SBIRs in the field of material science for orthopedic implants, as an example. So 2 ways to do this. The SBIR.gov registry takes data from all of the 11 SBIR agencies and compiles it into one database, and you can search there. It's a little bit slow to be propagated. SBA runs this website, and it waits for the data from the 11 agencies each year. So another way to do this, or a good complement to that general search, is to go to the agency-specific websites. And I've given you just 2 examples here for the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. But each agency maintains its own database of funded projects. So to look for companies that have already received SBIRs to be a potential licensing, we tend to think of, you're developing a diagnostic or a therapeutic, or a new material to be used in aircraft, in the military. You tend to think about looking for big companies, but looking for small companies who might be able to partner with you is something that people don't typically think about. So using the databases, for example, from NIH or DoD here or the other agencies, can be a great way for you to look for a company to partner with. Okay, another thing that Rob asked me to talk about briefly is investigating new sources of grant funding. So this is an interesting question. The primary focus on this webinar is SBIR and STTR, which we're going to jump into in just a minute. But I often get companies calling me and asking me if there are other sources of money besides. I said, what else besides SBIR and STTR is there? And the short answer is there's really not much. But I wanted to give you a few resources of places you can go. So certainly, as we talked about before, you might have ideas and there's not a company formed yet, or you might already have a company. But if you're a postdoc or a graduate student, chances are you don't already have a company formed. So a couple of pre-company resources that are fairly new are the National Science Foundation's I-Corps program. I-Corps is primarily from NSF, targeted to research that's been funded at the university level by NSF. And these are grants that take the research and the researchers, pair them with some business expertise, and do due diligence on the customer and market side to see if it makes sense to move forward with forming a company and then transferring the technology into that company using SBIR and STTR. Very recently, the National Institutes of Health has partnered with NSF for an I-Corps version for NIH. So for those of you that have technologies disclosed that you want to do some market due diligence, and if you've had NIH or NSF funding, these are good opportunities to get some of that done as part of the decision-making process to form a company. Grants.gov, which I have here on the bottom because you can do this pre or post company, is the federal portal where all grants available are funneled now. So you can do a lot of searching through grants.gov to look for different types of non-dilutive grant funding. But I want to caution you on one thing. There's a huge difference between your entity being your small business. Let's assume now that you decide to form a company. And so there is a company. Your small business may be eligible for lots of different grant opportunities, but whether or not you'll be deemed competitive is a very different assessment. So if you're applying for SBIR and STTR, you are competing with only small businesses. If you apply for a basic research grant from NIH, you'll see that a small business is eligible, but you try and compete with University of Virginia or Virginia Tech on a basic research grant, and you almost always find that you're not competitive. So we primarily focus on SBIR and STTR because that's the most likely place for small businesses to be competitive with the types of funding to get high-risk technologies reduced to practice into products. So I hope that helped give you some things to think about relative to your options as an inventor on the technology or as somebody working on technology that's been invented in the labs where you worked, at some of your options from becoming an advisor to a company all the way through to starting your own. Let's take a look at SBIR and STTR and how it funds small businesses, and we're going to briefly cover some of the eligibility requirements. And then as Rob mentioned, you can get more details through other webinars and training courses. So SBIR and STTR is a type of non-dilutive funding. This is funding that you don't have to pay back like you do a bank loan. It's funding that doesn't take ownership in your company, like the equity that an investor, like a venture capitalist or an angel investor, might put in. It's money that does not take ownership, does not need to be paid back. So SBIR and STTR is a very, very compelling type of funding because it builds value in your company without having to give away, sell a piece of your company for that value. And the best way to kind of position where SBIR and STTR fits, most of you are currently existing on the left side of the screen where it's federally funded research, where you're creating new ideas. The goal of SBIR and the goal of university tech transfer in general is to take those ideas and have those innovations turned into commercial product. But there's this huge gap in the middle, and this is where it's very, very, very difficult to find money to take high-risk technologies. And I kind of call this, it's been referred to as the valley of death. I call it the come back when problem, because it typically is when you go out to raise money from investors, as an example, or from corporate strategic partners, and they tell you that's very interesting technology. We're very interested in the problems you're trying to solve, and we think there's a great commercial opportunity, but we really don't want to talk to you until the technology works. So come back when you have a working product. And so the whole idea of SBIR and STTR is to reduce the technology risk to the point where others will come and fund the transition into commercialization. So as a reminder, SBIR and STTR fund small business and small business only. They fund small businesses to do a very specific thing, to develop products based on high-risk technology, with the ultimate goal being to commercialize those technologies. So one thing I'd like to point out, and this is where a lot of the use of SBIR and STTR is problematic, is applied research, translational research, certainly is what's going to get you from basic research into product development. But you have to be very clearly focused on getting a product. This is not just an extension of your research. We're not just doing applied research. We're doing product development. And this is certainly not the money to help fund your lab. So while laboratories at a university can participate as subcontractors on SBIRs and STTRs, and we'll talk about that briefly in a minute, when I get universities calling me and saying it's so hard to get basic research money now, NIH pay lines are so competitive, so we're encouraging our postdocs and our faculty to go after SBIR and STTR. That's the wrong reason. The right reason to go after SBIR and STTR is because you've got products that need to be developed at small businesses, and that technology is very high, and the small business is the right place to develop those technologies as opposed to large industry. The SBIR and STTR programs are set forth by legislation. There are 11 federal agencies that are mandated to participate in SBIR, and 5 of those 11 agencies in STTR. So it's important that you know, and it's very cool, the SBIR STTR programs are currently authorized by legislation through 2017. So this does not have to be subject, this isn't subject to annual appropriations. So the SBIR and STTR programs are funded through 2017, and the 11 federal agencies that have money, which I'm showing you here, have to participate. So the large agencies are the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and NASA. And those agencies are large enough that they're subject to both the SBIR and STTR legislation, so they have both programs. And then the small agencies, which are Agriculture, Transportation, Environment, Commerce, Education, and Homeland Security, have SBIR only. I'm going to talk just a little bit more in a minute about the differences between the agencies, but the ones that you see there in the lighter lilac-y color versus the darker purple are the agencies that are the granting agencies. And then DOD, NASA, Transportation, those agencies are contracting agencies, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But these are your options for looking for SBIR and STTR funding. And again, it funds product development based on high-risk technologies where there's a credible commercialization strategy. SBIR and STTR is not fast money. This is money that takes a long time to apply for. It's very competitive, although not nearly as competitive as just about any other source of money for this type of work. Venture capital is orders of magnitude more competitive than SBIR, but it's a long period of time over which the money is dispersed. So this is not for projects that have to get to market very quickly. An overall SBIR STTR project typically is done over a period of 3 to 4 years, and typically $1 million to $1.5 million is how much money you'll get. That's not an insubstantial amount of money, and companies can build portfolios of SBIR and STTR. So for example, if you're developing a therapeutic, you might have a set of SBIR or STTR awards to do the pre-IND work, including toxicology and animal studies, and you may have a second set of SBIRs to elucidate the mechanism of action. But the SBIR program, like other investment programs, because there's high risk, divides the project into pieces. And by legislation, an SBIR project needs to have 3 phases. Phase 1 is defined as feasibility. Phase 2 is defined as further R&D, and Phase 3 is defined as commercialization. And an important thing to note is the goal is commercialization. You are expected to commercialize, and you will need to describe how you intend to commercialize. But commercialization activities cannot be funded with SBIR and STTR dollars. SBIR and STTR dollars can only be used for the R&D portion of the company's work. That R&D portion, which are the Phase 1 and Phase 2, are broken down into those 2 stages, so that Phase 1 is the feasibility stage and Phase 2 is the further R&D stage. And by guideline, it's $150,000 in 6 months for the Phase 1 portion, followed by 2 years and $1 million for the Phase 2. Now those are guidelines, and each agency has its own rules and its own limits. Some agencies you can get up to $1.5 million or more dollars. Other agencies it might be under $1 million. And then each agency will have its own way of defining Phase 1 versus Phase 2. But if your product idea needs to be to market quickly, this is not the program for you. Now, SBIR, STTR terminology, just so you know, is all SBIR and STTR monies are awarded through solicitations. There's no such thing as an unsolicited SBIR. So you're going to submit a proposal or an application in response to a solicitation. And if successful, the company receives an award. And that award may be in the form of a grant or a contract. And so these are some of the differences between the agencies. And so if you'd like to learn more about most of these, I would encourage you to first go through a more expanded SBIR basics course. And then if you still want to pursue SBIR, I encourage you to get training on the specific agency that you plan to apply towards. But one thing I want to point out is there's one fundamental difference between the agencies, and that has to do with whose ideas they fund. And if you come from an academic institution, chances are you're familiar with NIH, and NIH, by the way, falls under the Health and Human Services SBIR program. In fact, they have the majority of the HHS money. So NIH, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, they tend to fund investigator-initiated research. So your ideas are funded through broad solicitations. And you're awarded a grant, which is a very flexible funding mechanism. The other side of the SBIR spectrum are the agencies like the Department of Defense and NASA, where their solicitations have very discrete and specific and detailed topics. Topics specific to the type of technology, the product, all of the details will be specified. So in that case, you're responding to a specific project that they're requesting someone do. So there's a huge difference, and it tends to be a little bit easier to work with the granting agencies when you're trying to be strategic in getting a specific project that you want done funded. If you have technologies that are suitable for defense-related applications, then you have to either hope that the Department of Defense has already acknowledged that and has a specific topic in their solicitation, or you have a longer-term business development task to make them aware of what you're doing and hope that an SBIR topic will be released in a future solicitation. So if you have technologies that are going to take 3 or more years to reduce to practice in a product, and you determine that you and your institutions determine that a small business is the best place to do that, then what we have to understand is some of the SBIR eligibility requirements. And SBIR and STTR both are appropriate for small businesses only. Those small businesses have to be for-profit entities that are U.S. owned and controlled, that are small, which is defined as less than 500 employees, located in the United States, and all the work has to be done in the United States. Now, the ownership requirements and the control requirements are a little bit complex. The very brief description is that the company has to be majority owned, and majority is defined as more than 50%, by U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So green card holders are treated as U.S. citizens in this instance. And more than 50% of the ownership and the control of the small business has to be in the hands of one or more individuals who are U.S. citizens or permanent residents, and or other small businesses that themselves are owned by U.S. citizens, permanent residents. Minority owners, so up to 49%, can include foreign individuals, foreign entities, nonprofits, large corporations, as long as those minority owners don't control any more than a minority of the company. There's a new provision that allows companies that are owned by multiple investment funds, and investment funds include venture capital operating companies, hedge funds, and private equity funds, to participate in SBIR and STTR as well. So as you're looking at either establishing a small business or working with a small business, it's important that you determine that business's eligibility. And if you're a Virginia company, you can touch base with Rob, look at some of those other webinars, and or contact us, and we'll be happy to try and talk with you about the ownership. The other thing you have to be careful of is the size is less than 500 employees, and that's for your company and any affiliates. And essentially an affiliate is an large entity that can reach through and control the small entity. So there are some nuances here. The majority of companies don't have these issues, but it's important that you understand that you meet those requirements. Here's a requirement that has not to do with the eligibility of the company, but it has to do with the eligibility of the company's resources. And this one I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but I'm going to stress the fact that you need to kind of make a note of this. The small business has to have what's called company-controlled research facilities suitable to do the work proposed. Whether you're doing an SBIR or an STTR, the small business, when they receive the award, must have its own independent company-controlled research space. All of the work of SBIRs, all of the work of STTRs may not be done at an academic institution. Academic institutions can participate as collaborative subcontractors, and I'm going to talk about that briefly in just a minute, but they are always a subcontractor, and the small business has to have its own company-controlled research space, whether it be in an incubator or whether it be independent space that that company has. The space has to be suitable for the company's work. So obviously if you're developing software, the requirements for your R&D space are very different than if you're developing therapeutics. There are lots of misconceptions in academic institutions about the difference between SBIR and STTR. As graduate students and postdocs, I encourage you to collect information not just within the institution but outside the institution. If you rely on input from faculty, other postdocs and graduate students, even from research administration within your institution, there's a good chance that they don't have a full understanding of the difference between SBIR and STTR. I'm going to cover it very briefly here, and then again, there's more detailed information out there to help you. Only 5 of the agencies have both SBIR and STTR. Small businesses often lack resources. They lack people, they lack facilities, specialized facilities, unique expertise, niche expertise. And both SBIR and STTR recognize that and provide a way for small businesses to bring in outside expertise. Small businesses can bring in outside expertise both by hiring consultants, who are individuals who give them advice, or by collaborating with other organizations. And that is where we have another company that has a facility, research facility, maybe an animal facility, for example, that we need to get experiments done at, and we subcontract with that institution to use their scientists to do this work in their facility. So SBIR allows you to do this. So if your small business is applying for SBIR, you can subcontract to an academic institution to do animal studies. You can hire a researcher from an academic institution as a consultant, but you don't have to. If you have all of the resources you need, all of the work of the SBIR can be done at the small business. STTR is a little different. STTR is still a small business award. Only small businesses apply for and receive STTRs, but the small businesses are required to collaborate with what's defined as a nonprofit research institution, so a university or other nonprofit research institution. So STTR requires the participation of a university, but it's important to note that the applicant is always the small business, the recipient of the award is always the small business, and the university acts as a subcontractor. There are some limitations now as to how much work can be done by this subcontractor. And in an SBIR, a small business is restricted to no more than 1/3 of the work of the Phase 1 and 1/2 of the work of this Phase 2 being outsourced. Now these are usually defined as part of the budget, so typically it would be 1/3 of the overall amount of money received in a Phase 1 can be used to hire consultants and subcontractors, and no more than 1/2 of the money received in a Phase 2. So the majority of the work in a Phase 1 and at least half of the work in a Phase 2 has to be done at the small business in an SBIR, and that can be up to 100% can be done at the small business. In an STTR, because we require a collaboration between the small business and the nonprofit research institution, we've now got some slightly different requirements, and this is where the small business has to do at least 40% of the work and the nonprofit research institution at least 30% of the work. So now we've got partners working together, and you as a postdoc or a graduate student may have a choice. You might be able to go to small business and work on either an SBIR or an STTR, or you may be able to stay at the academic institution and work on a subcontract. And both SBIRs and STTRs can have subcontracts to academic institutions. The other requirement that we have, and this is one that can become particularly powerful for postdocs, is where the principal investigator of the project is employed. Make sure you know the difference between effort on a project and employment. Employment is where you work, and effort on a project is what you do while you're at work. And some of you may have questions on this. This tends to generate a lot of dialogue. When I do on-site training, we can spend the better part of an hour or two talking about the differences between SBIR and STTR, subcontracting relationships, employment status, and whatnot. But to be PI on an SBIR, that person has to be more than half-time employed at the company. And this is where postdocs who have an interest in moving to a small business that have been working with faculty who want to remain faculty, this is where there's a very powerful way to have that postdoc transition to the small business to act as PI, as long as there's typically some relationship, either a consulting, advisory, or subcontractual relationship with the more senior scientist. I would say that if you're a graduate student and you're still completing your terminal degree, your ability to justify your expertise to be deep enough to act as PI is going to be probably difficult unless you've done something in between. But for postdocs who have been working in the labs where the technology was developed, this is a good way to take the technology and the postdoctoral person and move together to the company. And in an STTR, this mechanism for 4 of the 5 agencies, so for NIH, DOD, NASA, and Department of Energy, the PI can either be at the small business or at the nonprofit research institution. Since those 2 organizations are collaborating, please note if the PI of an STTR is at an academic institution, unlike a basic research grant, this is not their grant and it's not the academic institution's grant, it's the small business's grant, and you're strictly acting under a sponsored research agreement as the PI. So STTRs engender some additional paperwork that needs to be done from a number of the organizations, but a couple of things to note here that I think are worth pointing out to the particular audience I'm speaking to today. I think you've figured out by now that you can't be quote-unquote a virtual company. You can't have no facilities, you can't be doing all the work at the university. You must have company-controlled research facilities, and somebody has to be working in those facilities. And then you must be awfully conscious of conflict of interest issues. I'm not going to talk about them anymore here, but the minute that you start a company, license technology to the company, and have individuals who are involved with the company and the institution that licensed the technology, there are typically going to be conflicts of interest. And this will apply both to SBIR and STTR. So you want to be cognizant of those things as well. Please feel free to check out our website, bbcetc.com. We maintain a list of all of the current solicitations that are open. I took this snapshot the other day. Different agencies work on different funding schedules. There's a lot of stuff open right now. National Institutes of Health, which is HHS, Health and Human Services, Defense, is coming out with a solicitation tomorrow. National Science Foundation just closed, but they'll have something else open soon. So, use our website as a way to start trolling some of these solicitations and seeing what might be a fit for you, your interests, your technology, your institutions. So, lastly, as a reminder, SBIR and STTR fund small businesses, and we've just very briefly defined small businesses. Goal is to develop product that can be commercialized based on high-risk technologies. And as graduate students and postdocs, it is likely that you're going to end up conducting scientific research that will lead to some breakthrough technologies, some phenomenally compelling ideas. And just remember now that we're not any longer doing research. looking to develop products best done in industry, and if small business is the best place to do it, then SBIR and STTR can be millions of dollars that can help get that technology far enough down the road that others will start to engage with the small business. What do you need to apply? Well, you have to have an eligible small business concern. SBC is some terminology used in the SBIR program. You can form one. You can find one to work with, but there has to be one to apply. You have to be doing product development. You can't just be doing translational research. It's product development. It has to be based on technological innovation, distinguished from innovation alone. It's not just innovation. It's innovation based on really risky technology. So high risk, long-term needs for scientific development are good ways to think about technological innovation. You have to have company-controlled research facilities. Now please note that those research facilities have to be identified at the time of application so that they can be described in your application. But you don't actually have to move into those facilities until you receive the award. Similarly, you have to have people who are going to be employed at the small business. You have to at a minimum identify those people at the time of application, and then you're going to have those people go work for the small business at the time of award. And you have to find an agency that has a solicitation open. You can't, so I got off the phone this morning with a company that's very interested in applying to the Department of Education. The Department of Education released their solicitation about a week ago. It's due January 15th, and they're not ready yet. And it'll be another year before the Department of Education has another solicitation. So you have to be ready, and you have to find a solicitation that's open. And then, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, you have to have discipline, energy, enthusiasm. You have to be able to follow directions. You have to have patience. And most of all, you should get help. So what's next? Well, assess your personal goals. How much risk do you want to take? Is forming a company right for you? Is being the entrepreneur right for you? Or are you going to be more personally appropriate to maybe be employed by a company where someone else is taking the big risk? Find a business. You can form one. You can find one. Make sure that your institution is amenable, if there is intellectual property owned by the institution, to collaborating with or to working with your new company or the existing company as a potential licensing partner. And then if it's you, is it your technology? Or by that I mean, are you an inventor? If yes, can the small business get the rights? If no, it's not your technology, do you want to work for a small business? Because a great way to get started is to work for other small businesses. And remember, we talked about you can look and see who those small businesses are. You can see every small business that's gotten an SBIR by searching those databases I showed you. I encourage you to attend training courses. In Virginia in particular, CIT sponsors a diversity and a plethora of training courses. There should be within the next 6 months many opportunities for you to get more detailed training. And then regardless of whether it's your technology, whether it's technology that the small business has, the most successful companies are when there's a really, really engaged and enthusiastic technology entrepreneur, technology individual who's willing to be the proposal driver for the SBIR company. I've introduced a number of postdocs who decided not to pursue an academic career to small businesses who've hired them, and the first thing they've done is spent a couple of years developing SBIR, STTR proposals and bringing money into the company that either funds a job for themselves or funds expansion of the company. So I hope that helped. Rob, I hope that hit on some of the key points that we wanted for our postdocs and our graduate students, and I am very happy to take any questions if anybody's got any questions.
There's no questions that have come through yet. I had a comment to just one word of thought is as you mentioned, Lisa, the timing scenario of SBIR. So what we suggest typically is you're a year out from perhaps departing the university and you're making these decisions. It could take 6 to 9 months before you start writing it, apply, and wait, and then receive the award. So that gives you enough food for thought and a leeway of time, so to speak, to consider this. It's not, it can be done in many different ways and different scenarios, but that's just something to think about. as Lisa mentioned, we did have you talk about what a project looks like. We ran one of the webinars that we have pre-recorded on our website is one that is like about an hour and a half long, and it discusses what projects look like. It actually does a good job of kind of just doing a rehash of the basics of SBIR, but then it talks about what the projects kind of look like. So one of the things that we find is most important for companies or the researchers are thinking, I mean, what is the project the SBIR doing compared to the overall product development? It's usually what particular one or two key things need to be discovered that will then allow for the full commercialization to be developed. You're not developing the whole product in phase one. The feasibility is feasibility. It's one or two key aims that if this can't be done, then nothing, that probably won't be able to be done in the full. And that's what phase one's about. So the workshops we give and the webinars can help you figure that out a little bit more, and also I think one-on-one discussions with the consultant, with Lisa and myself, we can kind of figure that out. There's a couple of questions that have come through. Is this funding available only for the citizens or international postdocs or grad students too? So I guess, for international students, Lisa, what's your comment on that?
Yeah, so we have to distinguish between who owns the company and who's doing the work. Ownership of the company has to be more than 50% owned by U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So if you are neither a U.S. citizen nor a permanent resident, you can certainly own a percentage of the company, but you and any other non-permanent residents would have to be minority owners collectively. But you don't have to own the company to be employed by the company and work on the SBIR or STTR. However, at that point, then, you have to be apprised of your immigration status. If you're on a student visa, and I'm not an immigration law expert, but you have to have the appropriate visa status to work at the small business if you want to work at the small business on the SBIR or STTR. There is no citizenship requirements per se for PIs or for employees as long as you have the right visa status to be employed at the company. So I hope that answers that.
And we actually have, and one of the pre-recorded webinars is a whole, I think, hour and a half long eligibility requirements, and it talks about that as well as the ownership parts. It takes it all into consideration. Yep. A couple questions came through here, so stick around. You may have answered this, but could a PhD candidate be the PI on the SBIR STTR grant? Any citizenship or permanent residency required for that? I guess that's...
So what I just meant, no citizenship requirement for the PI. Can a graduate student, a PhD student, I'm not going to say no, but it's highly unlikely. The question is, what have you done collectively in your career to date to deem that you're qualified to have the key scientific and technical expertise to do some of the work on the project and to lead the project? So you may have gone, if you went straight from undergraduate to graduate school, you're still waiting to complete your PhD, I would tend to think that's going to be extremely difficult to justify that scenario for a PI. On the other hand, maybe you graduated with a bachelor's or a master's degree, went and worked in industry for a number of years, decided to go back and get a PhD, you're completing your PhD, and the education and experience you've had in getting your PhD combined with the previous experience you had may give you the necessary expertise and experience to act as PI. So there's no requirement by any agency that says a PI must have X degree, must have a master's, must have a PhD, must have an MD. There are no requirements of that type. As long as you have the qualifications, you're qualified, so it's a combination of what you've done both educationally and work-wise, and you meet the employment requirements at the time of award. So obviously you'd have to have finished your PhD before and be able to work more than half time at the company at the time of award. So it will be a subjective assessment, so it depends on the combined experience that you have.
And I'll make a comment on that too. There's a couple trains of thought as far as what is technology, and obviously it varies from if you're doing cancer research compared to if you're doing cybersecurity, IT kind of stuff, right? Very different. Different backgrounds and different requirements from industry as to what levels are required. I mean, if you're developing a simple, a weekend, those the meetup group startup weekends at the universities, and you get 3 buddies together and you meet and you develop an app for your iPad. to help order flowers quickly. Okay, that's great, but it's probably not an SBIR. It could be a venturable company from a if a big business problem is being solved and you can figure out a way to get that to market and get money over the next 3 months, great. But that's probably not SBIR or STTR. You're talking about a key, hurdle, a big technology hurdle you're trying to overcome in SBIR. So the difference in the kind of technology and might also lead to what the kind of the expertise needed by the PI and the rest of the company. So every situation is a little different to think about. So certainly I think you want to understand and present it in the best business case, think the business side of things, and then work backwards towards the technology required, what the level of trust will be from industry required for you to actually get it out there. There's a couple other questions. Let me see what this. Okay, I have a small business in consulting and an MA in my field and have gone back to get my PhD and spoke to advisor in school prior to coming to start. I wanted to do an SBIR with the school prior to arriving. I am concerned if doing a provisional patent is necessary since I am also a student, but got the idea and research prior to coming. So you had the idea, now you're at the university, graduate school, getting a so the question is who owns the technology, and I think you can.
So I'm going to answer that typically, and I don't want to make a blanket statement. Typically, students are not subject to the ownership provisions that employees are. So most students that have inventions own their own inventions. You can certainly read, I'm sure your institution has a lot of information on their Office of Technology Transfer's website, and I'm sure there's information related to student inventions, but typically a student owns their own inventions. I just don't want to make any blanket statements. Also, typically, if you invented something prior to going to the institution, regardless of whether you're an employee or a student, you typically own that, but if you are an employee, if you are going to be employed by an institution and sign an employment agreement that states, and this would not be a student but an employee, that states that you're going to assign any inventions to the institution, I would make sure as part of my negotiation to get clear exemption of any technologies I'm bringing with me. So you kind of said two things in your question. One, that you invented something prior to going to that institution, and two, you were a student. So those are kind of the two separate pieces of advice on those two pieces of that scenario.
Okay. How can a recent PhD candidate find out about small businesses in Virginia in need of expertise in a different field? That's the million-dollar question sometimes, is trying to find the companies. Lisa mentioned some websites. Depending on what university you're at, a lot of them have business support program centers. I know Virginia Tech's got VT Knowledge Works, UVA's got some programs, VCU has a gateway, and they all interact with the business community in a lot of ways, and they might be able to provide some insights and guidance and connections. Getting out there and getting involved in the local technology community is often a step. I know all these entities I mentioned there's technology councils that exist in those areas that are very amenable and friendly to try to connect experts in technology with the business community. So those are some things that are out there. And Lisa mentioned the website, the SBIR.gov, that you can find the award winners. You can kind of find there's around the universities. If you're willing to move and travel, depending on where you're from and where you're going to school, there might be different places. The major employment centers in Virginia are around the academic, Virginia Tech, Charlottesville, Richmond, Northern Virginia, and the Tidewater area are all, they all have a lot of SBIR activity in Virginia. Virginia's about third in the country in SBIR, so there's over a couple hundred awards given each year to Virginia-based companies. So there's a lot of companies in the area who are familiar and might be looking for your talent. So, one thought is to engage with, if you find a company, the company needs to apply. So your employment with them could be contingent upon them winning winning that. And so they'd have to build you into the proposal if you're going to be the PI or on the team in some capacity. So, that might not be a bad way to go if you're looking for transition to another company in the area you're working in. Hope that was helpful. That's not an easy question to find. How do you find the right companies to work for? There's a lot can go on with that, and I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Lisa.
I'm not based in Virginia, so I'm not specifically familiar with the Virginia resources, but Rob's absolutely right. A lot of networking is really the way to go. But I would encourage you. You can very easily pull up a list of every single company in Virginia that has an active SBIR award and or that has had SBIR awards in the past. And you can read abstracts. When you bring up those lists from the various agency sites and from the SBIR.gov website, there will be an abstract. There will be contact information for the principal investigator. So if you find any where the technologies that they're working on are synergistic with your backgrounds, I would encourage you to connect with the principal investigator and schedule a time to talk with them. And if you bring some interest and expertise, Rob's absolutely right. You never know when they've got existing SBIRs and they need to bring someone in to work on them. Another thing to note, remember, if they have a phase 1, hopefully they're going to write a phase 2. Phase 1s are 6 months and $150,000. Phase 2s are 2 years and $1 million. So, finding them at the phase 1 stage and engaging with them and getting them familiar with your expertise as they write their phase 2, Rob's absolutely right. They might be able to write you in. So I would use those SBIR databases as a great way to make contact with Virginia-based companies that have SBIR awards currently.
And if anybody needs help in identifying the resource in your region, let me know. I'm happy to try to make some connections that will get you start to thinking. One last question is, by the time we applied for the grant, should the company be registered?
For the majority of agencies, the company, in order to, and this isn't true for all of the agencies, but for almost all of the agencies, all of the granting agencies that use grants.gov and the contracting agencies require that the small business be formed prior to submission. The small business will have to have an EIN number from the IRS, and the small business will have to have a bank account. At that point, you typically have to get a DUNS number from Dun & Bradstreet, and then depending on the agency, you're almost all guaranteed to have to register in the System for Awards Management, and at that point there might be some additional registrations. One of the outliers, the Department of Education's current solicitation is actually emailed directly to them, so some of those registrations can be done at the time of award. But in all cases that I'm aware of, the small business has to be formed as a legal entity and have an EIN number and a bank account. And then then from there it will be agency specific. But the other comment I'll make, the majority of agencies do require the registration in the System for Awards Management, which is called SAM, and that can take 6 to 8 weeks minimum after you get your EIN number. So I often see people kind of brushing me off when I tell them that they need more time, and they will tell me, my attorney said it's really easy to get an LLC formed and I can get an EIN number very quickly. And those are both true. But it takes a while before the other systems at the federal level can validate the EIN number. So even if you have one, if you just received it, it can take weeks for it to be validated. And then the System for Awards Management can be 6 to 8 weeks to get registered in. So know which agency you want to apply to and make sure you look into their registration requirements early, because you could need a good 2 to 3 months after you form your company before all your registrations will be done.
And that's the way it goes. Yeah. Well, in follow-up, I will be providing everybody today a copy of today's presentation. We'll send a PDF via email out to everybody. I will provide the link to the CIT's webinar section on our website. It's not the easiest thing to find, so I'll send that link to you. And there are the webinars that include the overview of the program, a little bit detail on what project feasibility scope looks like, the eligibility requirements, a commercialization planning, a teaming, really interesting one on teaming, and then there's also there's a couple others on there too that might be of interest to you. There's a small fee for some of these. Some of them are free, especially for university researchers and postdocs and grad students. So take a look at that. I do have a workshop if you're in the Richmond area or can travel there easily and you're interested in really learning more. The workshop is next Tuesday. It's an all-dayer, 9 to 5. Current rate for university researchers is just $40, which is For small companies, it's only 70. These are for Virginia-based entities. It's about a couple $100 for non-Virginia companies. We'll gladly take their money to help pay for the the event, but I will send an email out to everybody about that. And if you have any questions, otherwise we'll be doing other training at various places around the Commonwealth next spring. So some of those registration processes you might want to get started. Thinking about your approach to things, just to have leverage and be able to do it if you decide to. We typically recommend agencies like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health provide, as Lisa mentioned, a myriad of opportunities as far as the solicitations themselves are very broad, and you basically create almost your own topic. So their next deadlines for the NIH is in April, and for the NSF is in June. So you would, if you're targeting either of those, you have a few months to get started on getting the solicitations, at least the registrations done, and then that will give you at least 2 or 3 months to write the compelling proposal, so that 6 months or so later after that, you might be getting the award. So right now we're looking at the next June deadline, the June deadline for NSF. You would be getting the money about this time next year. So if you're thinking about your future and what you're going to be doing, think about it that way. And similarly for NIH, the April deadline is next. And then, so you wouldn't be getting the money until about October, November of next year for those. So those are just two of the examples that are really the really good, more commercially focused. And there's the other, there's about 30 or 40 deadlines per year overall in SBIR and STTR with all the agencies and different solicitations in SBIR, CTR. So a lot of opportunities coming up. So with that, there are no other questions coming through, Lisa. I will CC Lisa on the email I'll send out, so you can respond to her directly if you have any questions. You want to make connection with them directly. I will add everybody to my newsletter, so you're more made aware of future training opportunities, and you can always opt out of that newsletter. We don't recommend that, of course, so just for food for thought. And well, thank you everybody for today, and hopefully we will be able to see you out there when we get out there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob.
All right, thank you, Lisa.